we are talking about Protagonist today, the main character. The previous 2 weeks have been heavy on like the theoretical stuff. Why do we write? How do we generate ideas? Here you're going to get my first definitive nuts and bolts piece of advice. And the thing about that I want you all to keep in mind, not just from me and my lessons, but from any craft book, any creative writing, any criticism really in general, writing, creative writing in particular, is super, super, super subjective. And in art in general, very rarely are there hard rules. Once again, the caveat is always that even though I do think I'm, reasonably qualified to talk about this stuff, that doesn't mean that I have all the answers, or that my answers, some of my ways of thinking are going to be mutually exclusive with other artists. There are some works that I really love that other people think are trash. There are some works that I think are trash that are considered classics. It's all really, really subjective stuff. And the main takeaway I want you to have from these is that my suggestions and my ideas are more tools that you can use when you're working on your stuff in the future to refer to, and not hard and fast rules. More like guidelines than actual rules. Even stuff that seems like hard rules often can be broken for one purpose or another. However, with that said, when you're getting started, I think that the sticking closer to the rules is smart. Because it's not like... What's the best way to put this? When you want to go outside of what's conventional or outside of what's expected, the way that you're going to be able to work most effectively and break rules and break conventions are if you have a good understanding of those. And so at the start, that's why I would recommend you stick pretty close to traditional narrative, traditional convention. It's possible that you could go try to be David Lynch and get it on your first go, but it's a little unlikely. But even David Lynch films, as weird as they're known for being, often do still have pretty traditional narrative structures and character arcs. So this is good stuff to know in general, even if you don't stick to it, 100%. Are you making a cameo on the stream, dog? All right, see you later. Bye. Say bye to Rosie, everybody. Anyway, I can let you guys chat amongst yourselves. I should probably get the ball rolling on this so we can start talking about what makes a good main character. As I've said before, aside from theme, because I think theme is the core of the story, but as far as like actual nuts and bolts mechanics, indisputably the most important thing is character. You can have all the well thought out prose in the world. You can have beautiful lyrical prose. You can have, excellent action in a movie. You can have all these other things, but if your characters are boring, if your characters aren't interesting, if you don't care about the people in the story, then why are you wasting my time with it? And because that's what it comes back to in the end, right? Stories are about people, or animals, or aliens, but, something that has, like, an experience being interpreted by a human. We're taking that animal and, like, saying something to humans about what that means. So, of course, what do I mean by the protagonist? Obviously, it's the main character. You all know that. This is a meme from Yu-Gi-Oh! Spot the protagonist, because in anime, you have all these boring randos, and, the main characters have Yu-Gi-Oh! Hair like that, fun colors, and, oh, isn't that wacky? What a good jape. What a good meme. But the thing is that if you start to move away from the middle school definition of what we think a protagonist is, it becomes a little bit harder to pin down in a consistent way, that you can just make like one statement and say like, this is always the protagonist. I kind of wanted to go through and maybe bust a few myths, because when you have sort of the narrow view of what the protagonist is, or you don't understand the mechanics of what makes a good one, it can be hard to write a good one. So, let's go ahead and move forward. So, myth number 1. Hopefully you knew this already, because this is literal, like, middle school level stuff, but I can't take for granted that I don't have some middle schoolers or high schoolers in the audience. Myth: the protagonist is always the hero. This tends to be how it's explained to children, you know, studying literature for the first time. You know, obviously there are anti-heroes. Sometimes the bad guy is the hero. Sometimes the main character of a story is very morally gray. I mean, in the best stories, the main character tends to be at least a little morally gray, right? Like, that's what gives a character some depth, is that maybe they don't always make the right decision. Maybe they do act a little selfishly, and we have to like test them at times. So I won't bang on about this too much. But yeah, like, this is a picture of Walter White. Walter White is one of the most acclaimed, you know, well-developed protagonists in, you know, recent memory. And regrettably, because he is the protagonist, there are people who walk away from the story thinking that Walt is a hero that we should look up to, but he is not, and the story makes that pretty clear. Yeah, you can write a villain protagonist, you can write an anti-hero. You know, questions of good or evil may not even be on the table. Sometimes the antagonist isn't like a person, but yeah, I mean, we'll get into different kinds of conflict as well. So for now, let's move on to something that's maybe a little less obvious. So myth number 2, the protagonist is always the narrator or point of view character. So this is a picture of my man Leo DiCaprio as Jay Gatsby, of The Great Gatsby fame. And there's a bit of a debate, and I honestly wasn't even sure if this qualified. But Gatsby's kind of the classic example of this, and that book isn't narrated by him, by The Great Gatsby, despite that being the title of the book, the character that ostensibly the story is the most about. In that book, if it's been a while since you were in English class and didn't read it, it is actually a good story. If you don't want to read it, the 2012 version, I think, the movie with Leo in it's pretty good memes, and actually surprisingly faithful to the story. So, regardless, the whole point of The Great Gatsby is that you have this, you know, tragic figure, Jay Gatsby, and he's off pursuing, like, the love of his life, like, throwing all these ragers and having grand old parties. And we don't get the story from his perspective, even though the conflict, the tension, is about, like, the marriage drama between Gatsby, Daisy, and Tom Buchanan, Daisy's husband. The story takes place from the perspective of one Nick Carraway, played by Tobey Maguire in the movie. I believe it's written in first person. It's been a hot minute since I've actually read the book. But Nick is a character. He's not just the narrator. He does take actions that impact the plot. I believe Gatsby actually specifically approaches him because he's related to Daisy. It's sort of like an in, like, ooh, like, maybe you can set something up between us, something like that. I don't remember the details, but Nick is the point of view character of the story. He's the one telling the story. He's sort of implicitly the person the audience is supposed to identify with, and this is a common theme that often the narrator will be some sort of outsider to the situation. Like, you have, you know, international man of mystery Jay Gatsby, you know, rich person that we can't relate to, whereas Nick, although still, like, you know, a pretty rich person, pretty well off, much closer to the presumed perspective of the reader. Maybe, you know, comes from a more middle-class background, is sort of new to this New York, like, high society rich person nonsense. And so, even though Gatsby is sort of the tragic figure at the heart of the story, we get the story from Carraway's perspective. Does that make Carraway the protagonist? Honestly, he's got enough of an arc that you could argue yes, that, like, because Nick's feelings and the reader's feelings are, like, in sync, though, in the way they combine makes that and the reflection on Gatsby sort of the sort of the main point. But it kind of depends on how you view Protagonist. Is he the protagonist? Is he the main character? Are those the same thing? Are those different things? Where was I? Yeah. So with this narrator issue, this is a pretty common setup actually, even in film. I'll go to a more degenerate example of maybe this divide between main character and protagonist, or point of view character and protagonist. Dragon Ball Z. Who is the main character of Dragon Ball Z? It's Goku, right? Goku is the most famous character. Goku is the one who wins all the fights. Is his, growth to become the strongest. He's the central figure of the story. It's, been following him since his childhood. But similar to The Great Gatsby, Goku is so unrelatable to your average viewer. He's at best an aspirational figure to, become big and strong and heroic, that we need someone else to sort of look at Goku through their eyes. And several characters at different points in the story take on this role. In the very beginning, it's Bulma. She's just a normal, bratty teenage girl, and she goes on this quest and she meets this wacky monkey kid. So even though the reader can't really relate to Goku, the reader can much more easily relate to Bulma as just a normal person. I go through the different arcs of Dragon Ball. There's usually a character like this. There's usually somebody there who's more normal that we're getting the story through. So in the arcs following that, speaking of Krillin, like Krillin but worse, Krillin is often this character. He too, similar to Jay Gatsby and Nick Carraway, Krillin is also not super relatable. He's a weird monk boy with superpowers. But he is more normal than Goku, so that kind of implicitly puts him as the reader's point of view character. Then as we go on, as we get to the later parts of the show, later parts of the manga, we have Gohan, who's much more of a normal person than Goku is. About the same age even as your average reader for Shonen Jump. And we're seeing it all from his perspective. And yeah, so even though Goku's the protagonist, at any given point we have different POV characters. Even in something like manga, which unlike The Great Gatsby, which has a narrator, this is all implicit stuff. I think this is one of the reasons that so often in shonen manga you'll have characters off to the side commentating on things, right? It's to kind of ground you in that oh my god, impossible, that blast was so big, and the characters are in awe the way the reader is supposed to be in awe. But in the end, Krillin is not the protagonist, even if he's the character we're identifying with. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind, that this is a pretty common narrative trope in the cases where the protagonist or the person driving your story is so beyond the experience of your average reader, or such an international man of mystery that it would be hard for the person to even get behind. But yeah, so this is a pretty common narrative device, having some sort of everyman narrator who isn't necessarily at the heart of the story. Speaking of dweeb, who is this? This is Dio Brando from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. So here's a myth. Myth is maybe a strong word for this, but it's something that I was thinking about a lot when we were thinking about defining protagonists. Because again, the whole reason I'm going through all this stuff is that when you get away from sort of the middle school definitions of definitively who is the protagonist, it can kind of become a difficult question to answer. And the reason that I pulled up Dio here is that, well, so if the protagonist doesn't have to be the narrator, does the protagonist always drive the plot? JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, if you're not familiar, is an anime manga series and that has a lot of different story arcs, has a lot of different main characters. But the very first one is about the relationship between JoJo and his adopted brother Dio. Now, under the traditional assumption of, the protagonist is the person who drives the story, that would not be JoJo. That would be Dio. Because Dio's the one who's, like, constantly making plays. He's constantly, like, working his way up through the world. Basically, at every moment throughout the story, JoJo's just reacting to what Dio does. And in that sense, would we say that Dio is the protagonist? Well, people have made that argument, but I don't know. You know, JoJo is still, like, the character who we're following. You know, in that sense, we're kind of getting his point of view, but that doesn't necessarily make him the protagonist either. You know, JoJo's character is the one that, you know, he's unquestionably positioned as the hero, sort of the good guy that we want to see succeed because, you know, Dio is such a unrepentant monster. Wouldn't that just make him a good antagonist since he's a large contributing factor to the plot and story? Yeah, no, I mean, I think Dio's a great antagonist. I love Dio. And I think that you're hitting on something, you know, important in that, like, just saying that the protagonist is the person who drives the story. Every character should be driving the story, right? Like, a story should be characters' moves and counter moves and motivations and conflicts sort of like crisscrossing with each other. That's how you give something depth and texture. I chose the Dio example because, you know, it's JoJo Part 1 isn't the most sophisticated writing, so it stands out a little bit in that, like, pretty much every action, proactive move that someone makes in JoJo, at least in the first part, comes from Dio, and Jonathan is a very reactive protagonist. Is that necessarily a horrible thing? I mean, it's probably not good to have your protagonist be completely passive. We'll talk about why in a bit. But in general, like, yeah, I don't know if too many people would argue that, sincerely, that Dio is the protagonist over JoJo, even though, yeah, he's definitely the one driving the plot. You can call that sloppy writing, but I'm sure that if you know, noodled your brain a little bit more, you could find a lot of examples of stories where the villain is driving the plot more so than the hero, and the hero is more reacting. The Dark Knight, great example of this. That's a movie that people generally agree is pretty good. Who's the one making the moves in the story and putting it forward? Yeah, so I'm not familiar with this anime, but definitely would say the protagonists don't need to drive plot as long as their reactions to what is driving the plot is engaging. Yes, no, I totally agree. I think that The Dark Knight is a clearer, more well-known example of this, in that, yeah, the Joker is the one driving the plot. He's the one coming up with the schemes. He's the one, like, sort of proactively pushing forward. Whereas Batman at any given moment is mostly just reacting to what the Joker does. But, you know, we would never say the Joker is the protagonist. So, I mean, there's a lot of overlap with these things, right? The protagonist doesn't necessarily have to drive the plot. They don't necessarily have to be the hero. They don't necessarily have to be the point of view character. But for various reasons, they tend to be doing one or many of those things. You know, they're filling some of these criteria. Yeah, no, it's important to remember that you don't necessarily need to stick to one protagonist. In most stories, honestly, you probably should think about one character as your central character. It tends to be a matter of scope more than anything else, because A Song of Ice and Fire is this huge, sweeping epic. So, like, you know, I have 4 characters here that I would consider, for good chunks of the story to be some of the, like, primary players in, you know, that story. And at any given time, like, you know, once towards the regrettable ending of the show, they kind of all come back together, right? Well, 3 of them do. But the thing about these characters is that, like, at any given time, they are all in different places. Like, Jon Snow and Daenerys are off on, like, completely opposite ends of the world for the vast majority of the story, and any plot lines in the north and in the east are pretty much being filtered exclusively through them. Even throughout the rest of Westeros, though, like, is Tyrion the overall protagonist of A Song of Ice and Fire? I mean, not really, but is he the protagonist of, like, the stuff that's going on in King's Landing with the rest of the Lannisters? I mean, I'd say yes. Like, he's the character who we're following, who we're invested in. You know, he's making moves. He's marginally more sympathetic than the rest of the characters in King's Landing. So we're kind of invested in his outcome. I mean, Ned Stark it seems like the protagonist of the whole series at the very beginning. He follows a lot of those, like, more typical protagonist-y traits. And as far as this multiple protagonist story, I think it tends to be a matter of scope more than anything. Like I said, A Song of Ice and Fire is this huge sweeping epic, and I think the fact that you have so many rich characters that are well developed and can be considered protagonists of their own micro stories in their own right is a really, really talented thing. That's worth, like, studying and emulating, maybe. Because you want all your characters to be interesting, right? Like, your main character is sort of the core of the story, but, ideally, like, every character in your story should be, like, a fully fleshed out, interesting person. Like, that's what gives the story depth. And this idea of having multiple protagonists is sort of the logical extension of that. Game of Thrones / A Song of Ice and Fire is really interesting in general, just because there's so much that it does really well, but ended up being a unfinished disaster in terms of the books, because it got so out of control, and then we had the show to finish it, and that was a disaster for many bad writing reasons. Getting back to scope, though, the thing that I'll say about that is, like, in a much smaller story, let's say To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird takes place from the perspective of Scout Finch, and it takes place entirely from her perspective. We probably don't need as many protagonists in To Kill a Mockingbird as we do in Game of Thrones, because To Kill a Mockingbird is a social justice coming of age story. Glitch. But is Scout the protagonist? No, it's her dad. I'm not sure. You can make that argument. Because To Kill a Mockingbird is interesting in that Atticus seems like the protagonist of the courtroom plotline with, I wanted to call him Tom Joad. That's Grapes of Wrath. Oh, I can't remember what his client's name is. I can't even remember any of the other characters' names, just Atticus and Scout. But so a lot of To Kill a Mockingbird actually has little to do with that plot line. So I would argue that Scout's still the protagonist because it is more of a coming of age story. There are a lot of moments in that story that are just about, like, her growing up in the South and, like, being a little girl. So I would argue that she still is. Regardless, though, sort of getting back to the main point, you can maybe make the case that Atticus is the protagonist and it would be appropriate to get his point of view as well. But regardless, I think having, every single character in that small Alabama town be, like, Game of Thrones style fleshed out with 100 different point of view characters, that'd be a little bit much, right? Like, we want I think generally speaking, like, one, maybe two people is enough to, like, keep a reader rooted in the story, and then everyone else could sort of spread out from there. Again, that's not a hard rule. That's just a guideline. But do be open to the possibility of multiple protagonists, though. So, I've spent a lot of time talking about what a protagonist is not. Now let me give you my little working definition here. So, the protagonist is a character whose desires and growth are the reader's primary interest. They are the thematic core of the story. Now, this is purposefully broad, but I think one of the reasons that I like this definition is that it encompasses a lot of those previous things. So, like, they are the character that, for whatever reason, we are most interested in at any given time. So even though, in the Gatsby example, everything's getting filtered through Nick Carraway, we don't so much care about Nick Carraway as we do about Gatsby. In JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Dio may be driving the plot, but The Dark Knight. I should use The Dark Knight because it's more well-known. But, like, the Joker may be driving the plot in The Dark Knight, but Batman, hopefully, is the one that we want to see succeed. I know there are edgy Hot Topic kids who don't want to see Batman succeed. But, like, we want to see the hero triumph in that case, right? So even though, the Joker's driving the story, these, you know, the questions of having an arc and, you know, wrestling with, you know, all of these moral tests that the Joker puts them through, that all comes back to Batman. When I think about the main character, I guess the point of doing all this myth busting and having this definition was to show that there are a lot of different techniques for establishing your main character. They don't necessarily have to be just the hero or just the POV character or just the person driving the story or even just one person. There's a lot of different approaches that you can take to it, but ultimately I think what's most important is that whatever approach you take like ties back into your central theme. So even in like A Song of Ice and Fire, I would argue that it's thematically important that we get all these characters' different perspectives and, like, you know, the broad view of the political situation in Westeros beyond just the point of view of one character. Because if you actually look at the story, in a traditional fantasy novel sense, you could very easily make an argument that Jon Snow is the most important person in that universe. But for the kind of story that Game of Thrones is and the kind of themes it's trying to express, we can't just have the whole story take place from Jon Snow's perspective. We can't just have him be at the wall and then, like, you know, the War of the Five Kings going on as, like, background. That would be a much worse story than what we got, and what we got is a lot more richer and a lot more layered, because it plays with this idea of who's the protagonist in that way. And I think that's something that you want to keep in mind. You don't want to limit yourself real hard like that. Now that we have a working definition of a protagonist, the thematic core of the story, the person who we are most invested in any given story. Before we talk about what makes a protagonist good, I think it's a little helpful to talk about what makes a protagonist boring. And I have a hot take here, and I want to do some comparisons for my own purposes, because I think that of all the, like, major successful franchises, of all the major successful series and stories, Harry Potter is one of the most boring protagonists in all of fiction. So boring, in fact, that you would think he's like a Nick Carraway, but he's not really. Harry Potter's role in the story is sensible, and in some ways it kind of works for what Rowling is going for, at least in those first couple books, where it's more of a straight up kid story, and the whole point is basically the wish fulfillment fantasy of going to wizard school. I kind of struggle, like, if you ask me to identify what Harry's main, like, personality traits are, I struggle to identify those in comparison to Hermione and Ron. And I know that part of the point of that is that Harry's sort of our milquetoast everyman, and, like, we get his perspective on more interesting characters, including Hermione and Ron. That's a common argument that I see, and I think it's a pretty common trap that, although it's a useful tool to have a Nick Carraway sort of protagonist, I think that it's an easy trap to fall into, to take that too far and make your protagonist boring. Like, you can have a character who's sort of your your anchor in the story, that's more of an everyman while still giving them their own, like, wants and desires and personalities, and, you know, we'll talk about that in a minute. But I kind of wanted to do a bit of a compare and contrast to Luke from Star Wars, who I think is a very similar type of character done a lot better. And, you know, it's comparable genres, both, like, fantasy, like Chosen One, hero's journey fantasy. But the thing about Luke is that at any given point in the story, not only am I very easily able to tell you what the surface level, like, personality traits of Luke are, in that, you know, he's his brashness, you know, his hot-headedness, his naivete, but Luke actually changes quite a bit from movie to movie. Like, if you watch A New Hope and kind of get the angsty, like, teenager Luke that he's sort of known for, and then watch Return of the Jedi, it's very shocking to see how composed and how much more like, mature he is in that last movie. And I think that's a sign of a really good character, and that any given time in the series, I can not only tell you Luke's, like, surface level traits, but more importantly, I can tell you what he wants and what he needs. And those things change and evolve over the course of the story. Like, so as Glitch is sort of bringing up with the Harry Potter example, like, in, you know, the first couple of books, you know, maybe Harry has more of a thirst for adventure, which is a very common motivation. Luke has that motivation too in the first Star Wars movie. But yeah, as we get into the later Harry Potter books, it is mostly just sadness. I mean, I guess he wants to, like, smooch girls. There's a lot of focus on that in books 5 and 6. Wants to get it on with Ron's sister. I mean, he wants to defeat Voldemort, but, like, what else does Harry want? Like, there's a lot of focus on Harry sort of being this tool of the system who's not totally in charge of his own fate. But instead of really leaning into that, a lot of the books just feel like, you know, we're watching a character who isn't that motivated. You can have a character who is, like, being manipulated by broader forces, but usually, like, part of what makes that so much more of a feudal feeling is that if you have a character who is attempting to be an active agent and attempting to exert their own will and their own agency, and the story keeps denying them, then yeah, I think that's a lot more interesting than someone who just gets pushed around without having any sort of desire. And at any given point, I think this is the main difference between Luke and Harry, is that Luke's desires are always clear, they're always understandable, and they're always pretty easy to empathize with. Whereas, yeah, like, as a character, Harry Potter, as Glitch is sort of saying, as a character, Harry Potter already has what he wants. The stories are about him defending it from people who would take it away. There's less of an arc. There's not, like, Harry often doesn't feel like he's being tested, in any meaningful way, at least. I mean, this maybe bears mentioning. The phrase Mary Sue gets tossed around a lot. And it's not really that helpful of a term in writing and or criticism, to be honest. But I do think it does get at this idea that, like, as readers, we want our characters to struggle and sort of earn their happy ending, or even struggle and fail. That could be satisfying in its own way. And I think that if we look past the, like, bullet point list of traits of what makes a Mary Sue, because that's less important, right? And, like, a lot of good characters even will have a lot of those traits. The core of what makes a Mary Sue so frustrating is that, like, there's that lack of a struggle, that the conflict just isn't there. And I think this is something that frustrates a lot of people, myself included, about Harry Potter, is that it's not just that he is a, like, everyman. He's an everyman that seemingly gets whatever he wants. You know, he's automatically the best Quidditch player in the school, a sport that's built around him being the protagonist. You know, he's not the best in his class, but, like, he gets pretty good grades despite, you know, not studying that hard, really. And some of this goes remarked upon that, like, you know, a lot of this is, like, celebrity stuff that's sort of out of his control. And I think that his character is most interesting when he is dealing with that stuff. But a lot of the times it does just feel like we're taking the wish fulfillment aspect, and not really earning it. So, all right, enough discussing the individual bits and bobs with Harry Potter versus Luke Skywalker. Ultimately, if we're talking about what I think makes a good protagonist, it comes back to this, in that for no matter what type of protagonist, no matter what type of story, you need to be able to answer these three questions in order to make them feel rich and engaging. So, and these questions are, of course, what does this character want? What does this character need? And how do those wants and needs conflict with each other? This is how you make a dynamic character. If you can answer these three questions and as your baseline, you'll be in good shape going forward. you'll be able to write a story with layers. And the reason is this. So, one, if you have a character that actively wants something, that avoids that sort of like passive, reactive personality. Now, Glitch is right. You can have a character that wants to defend something. That is often very common in hero narratives. And that's fine. You know, if your character's wants are sort of passive to maintain the status quo, you know, it's a very relatable want. That can make a very effective story. But that's when part number 2 comes in. What does this character need? And the need is something that at the beginning of the story, the character should not be aware of. Like, the need should not overlap 100% with their want. That does not make for a terribly interesting story if it's just about someone setting out to get a thing and then doing that thing with zero complications. Which of course brings us to number 3. How do those wants and needs conflict with each other? Now, they don't need to be diametrically opposed. You know, a lot of underdog stories sort of require that the character's wants and needs have some overlap. A good example of this is Rocky. Rocky Balboa in the first movie, you know, sort of wants to prove himself, and, you know, wants to be like a great fighter, but his needs throughout that movie are so much more about his emotional state and about his relationships with the other characters, and with Adrian in particular. And, you know, when we get to the end of the movie, notably, the first Rocky movie doesn't end with Rocky becoming the champion. It ends with Rocky putting up a really good fight and lasting like 10 rounds in the ring and like earning the respect of his friends and his family. And that's sort of what, you know, again, these are things that are not necessarily mutually exclusive goals, but what Rocky wants is to like, you know, become the champion, to beat Apollo Creed. But what Rocky needs is to have that sort of like personal satisfaction and that self-respect just with the effort and the progress that he's made, and, you know, carry himself well as a person. And those aren't contradictory goals, but they are different goals. And so, you know, what's really satisfying isn't that, you know, Rocky wins against Apollo Creed in the end. It's that, you know, he you know, confesses his love to Adrian at the end, and, like, you know, gets a, you know, a admission of respect from Apollo Creed. However, that is not to say that the want and the need cannot also be mutually exclusive, or that can make for great drama. You know, we mentioned Walter White earlier. This is what often makes for good tragedy, is that what does Walter White want? Walter White basically just wants to be a vengeful, you know, macho asshole and, like, sell drugs and kill people. Walt's kind of a piece of shit from the start, and, like, that becomes more apparent as the show goes on. You know, Heisenberg was always the true Walt. The teacher was more the persona. What does Walt need in order to, like, you know, have pieces of character? What Walt probably needs is to escape from the life and, like, you know, dedicate himself to being a better father and a person and not let his pride get the better of him. And sort of what makes the drama of Breaking Bad so compelling is that we keep seeing situations where that conflict between Walt's ego and the well-being of the people that he does love in his life, and how shit just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and how he keeps trying to balance things by, like, a hairline thread. That's the show. Like I said, you know, I think that the point of Breaking Bad is less that, like, Walt's a good person who becomes a bad person. It's more that Walt was always a bad person who shows his true colors. So does Walt really, like, grow throughout the story? I would argue no. But we do see Walt's values getting tested over and over again, as a result of the wants and needs sort of conflicting with each other. And that's what makes for great drama. That's what makes for an interesting character, even though Walt isn't, like, a hero that we're rooting for in the traditional sense. So that sort of brings me to this next question, and I'm glad that Gilly brought up Superman earlier, because I think that the problem with Superman as a character isn't anything inherent to the character, but in people's lack of understanding of how to write Superman. So, Superman is a character, if we're talking about a character who doesn't struggle, who gets everything handed to him, like, Superman won the genetic lottery. Like, he is a good boy. He was, raised as a good old Kansas farm boy. He's got all the powers and all that stuff. And very rarely are we ever concerned for Superman's physical danger. There are a couple of people who can maybe put him in a tight spot and make us worry, like, Darkseid or Doomsday or whoever. But in general, we're not worried about Superman's health or well-being. So, does the protagonist always need an arc? Walter White, Superman, these are characters that I would argue don't have an arc, and yet, at least Superman at his best, is still a good character. And the reason is that you have to think about the way you approach a character like this a little bit differently then. So, if a character doesn't change over the course of a story, even if they don't have some revelation or growth in the traditional sense, I think that more than a character always needing an arc, a character always needs to be tested. That's where the conflict comes in. And whether they already have the values that they need and find a way to pass the test anyway, like Superman, that can be great drama. Or if they can keep getting tested and fail, like Walter White, I mean, that's tragedy, right? That's a form as old as storytelling itself, Greek tragedy, a character being undone by their fatal flaw. So yeah, in the best versions of Superman, often what's going on is less like, we are worried about the danger or even Superman's well-being. It's more about putting Superman in positions that are difficult for him to accomplish everything that needs to be done. The end of the first movie, the Christopher Reeve movie, is a good example of this. Now, granted, I think that movie also cheats by letting him just zoom back in time, and that's an example of Superman being done poorly, but it's a good setup. And the setup at the end of the 70s Superman movie is basically this. So you have Lex Luthor, who's going to launch 2 missiles. One of them at, like, the fault line for his evil plan, and one at Lois Lane, who's, like, on the other side of the country. Lex Luthor's like, what are you gonna do now, Superman? Like, you're such a powerful, big, strong, hunky guy. But I've launched 2 missiles. Even you're not fast enough to catch both of them. And also, I'm launching one of them at your girlfriend. So even here, like, Superman's values are being tested. There's still that element of, like, want versus need conflicting, right? Even Superman, like, what he wants to do is save everyone, or maybe even what he wants to do is prioritize Lois. But what he needs to do right now is sort of make a choice for the greater good. And that's where the drama of Superman comes in. It's not that, we're ever afraid that he's going to fall. It's that we continually put Superman in increasingly difficult positions, where we are testing his ability to save everybody. Because we know he wants to, but what he needs to do is figure out with a way to deal with that. And I think this is something that the Zack Snyder movies start to get at that could have been really interesting. Shame those movies had such poor writing in general, but, what's the want? Be a hero and save everyone. Like, what's the need? Like, come to terms with the fact that I can't save everyone. Like, that's compelling drama, even if your character's invincible. So, yeah, and maybe you could see, like, if you look at all these different forms, like with, tragedy, with anti-heroes, with villain protagonists, they may not have everything in common in terms of how the audience relates to them, in terms of how we identify with them, how we view them, but I think what they do have in common is this core of want versus need, and how those two end up, like, conflicting with each other, and how do we resolve that conflict? Can we resolve that conflict? Are we, gonna fall from grace? Are we gonna save the day like Superman? Are we reinforcing our values? Do we have to change our values? I think that's what it keeps coming back to in the end. And that's why, more than anything else. This is obviously not the be-all end-all of making a good protagonist, but you need to start here. Before you do anything else, before you've decided their personality, their individual traits, their voice, you need to figure out two things. What do they want? What are their expressed desires? What do they need? And how is that going to cause drama for themselves and for everybody else in the story? Well, I'm glad the ramble wasn't too distracting, at least. I mean, that is one of the reasons that I like the Twitch format instead of just like scripting YouTube videos. A, because I'm lazy and don't have things to do and don't want to script YouTube videos, but also like